shattering more than just David's handcrafted portrait, shattered 20 years of neighborhood peace. Orchestrated screaming about community property violations, while David's elderly father collapsed in shock. But Karen had no idea that the very ground she was standing on held a secret that would turn her righteous fury into her worst nightmare. Sometimes karma doesn't just knock it, demolishes everything you thought you knew about justice. The sledgehammers, rattling his coffee mug against the kitchen counter and jolting him from the peaceful morning routine he'd cherished for 15 years. The sound was wrong, metallic, destructive, deliberate. He rushed to his front window, still in his pajamas, and felt the world tilt sideways. The beautiful wraparound porch he'd spent 2 summers building by hand, board by board, with his late wife, Sarah's enthusiastic supervision. The porch where they'd shared countless evenings watching sunsets, where his father now sat every morning with his newspaper, where his daughter had taken her prom photos just 3 months ago. Door, nearly tripping over the debris already accumulating on his lawn. "Sir, please step back," barked the lead contractor, a thick-set man with forearms like tree trunks. "This is a legal demolition order." "Legal," David's voice cracked. "This is my property. This is my house." That's when he saw her. Wearing a silk bathrobe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Actually, David," Karen's voice dripped with false sweetness, "it's not entirely your property. The survey results came back yesterday, and your little porch project has been encroaching on community property for 15 years. David stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. "What survey? What are you talking about?" Karen pulled out a manila folder, thick with official-looking documents. "Your porch extends 18 inches into the community green space. According to the HOA bylaws, Section 4.27, any structure built on common area property can be removed without homeowner consent." The sledgehammer came down again, this time taking out the corner post where Sarah had carved their initials during their 5th anniversary. David watched the wood splinter and felt something inside his chest splinter with it. "Karen, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah and I built this porch together. She died on this porch. My father sits here every morning. Should have thought about that before you illegally expanded your living space," Karen interrupted, examining her manicured nails. Father, 83-year-old Henry Chen, appeared in the doorway behind them. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he gripped his walker. "What's happening, David? What's all this noise?" "Dad, go back inside," David said quickly, but it was too late. Henry was already staring at the destruction, his eyes wide with confusion and growing horror. "My morning spot," Henry whispered. "Sarah's flowers, the railing she painted, ... Karen's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Chen, but the law is the law. Your son should have followed proper procedures." "What procedures?" David whirled on her. "I got permits. I followed every city code, every HOA guideline that existed 15 years ago." "Guidelines change," Karen said with a shrug. "The community voted on new property line restrictions last year. You should have attended the meetings." David felt heat rising in his face. "You mean the meetings you scheduled during my work hours? The ones you forgot to put in the newsletter 3 months running?" The sledgehammer took out another support beam, and the remaining section of porch sagged dangerously. One of the workers called out, "Ma'am, we need to accelerate this. The whole structure's becoming unstable." Karen nodded briskly. Henry Chen made a small, broken sound and sat down heavily on the front steps, his head in his hands. David moved to comfort his father, but Karen stepped between them. "Safety regulations. He's sitting on my own front steps, which are now part of the demolition zone," Karen said, consulting her folder again. "The survey shows your stairs also extend into community property. You're making this up as you go along." Karen's smile was sharp as a knife. "Am I? Would you like to see the survey results? The HOA board approval?" She thrust the folder at him, and David grabbed it with trembling hands. The documents looked official stamps, signatures, legal language that made his head spin. But something felt wrong. The dates were too recent, the signatures too convenient. "This is dated last week," he said slowly. "You're telling me you had a survey done, got board approval, and city permits in 1 week?" "I'm very efficient when it comes to protecting community interests," Karen replied. "Where Sarah had planted her climbing roses." The wooden trellis exploded into splinters, and the roses still blooming in their late-season glory were crushed beneath falling debris. Henry Chen let out a sound that was half sob, half wail. Sarah's roses. She planted those for our anniversary, ... David dropped the folder and took a step toward Karen, his hands clenched into fists. You heartless, I'd be very careful. About making threats, David, Karen said, pulling out her phone. I'm already recording for insurance purposes. Any aggressive behavior will be documented. Behind them, the demolition continued with mechanical precision. 15 years of memories reduced to rubble in less than 30 minutes. The morning sun, which had always cast such beautiful light across the porch during David's coffee time, now illuminated only destruction. Why? David asked finally, his voice hoarse. Why are you doing this? Because you think you're better than everyone else. You and your perfect little immigrant family story. Your dead wife Saint Act. Your father, who everyone fawns over. You think you can just do whatever you want because people feel sorry for you. The words hit David like physical blows. This is about Sarah's death. This is about following the rules, Karen snapped, but her eyes blazed with something deeper than bureaucratic zeal. Rules that apply to everyone, not just the people who don't have sad stories to excuse their behavior. The last section of Porch came down with a crash that shook the ground. Where there had been a beautiful wraparound porch with climbing roses and hand-carved railings, there was now only a pile of broken wood and twisted metal. Henry Chen stood up slowly, his walker scraping against the concrete. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but steady. Karen, my dear, you have no idea what you've just done. Karen laughed, a sound like breaking glass. What I've done is enforce community standards. Something that should have been done years ago. Henry looked at her with eyes that had seen 83 years of human nature, and smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. You know, Karen, I've been meaning to mention something to you about that lovely garden of yours. Well, Henry said, adjusting his grip on his walker. I was looking at some old documents the other day. Property deeds, survey maps, that sort of thing. Fascinating reading, really, especially the original neighborhood plat from 1987. David saw something flicker across Karen's face, a shadow of uncertainty, and I couldn't help but notice something interesting about the property lines in this neighborhood, particularly the ones around your house. The demolition crew had stopped working, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Even the morning birds seemed to have gone quiet. Your beautiful garden, Karen, Henry said, his smile widening. The one you're so proud of. The one that won the Neighborhood Beautification Award 3 years running. Karen's face went white. That's impossible. Oh, but it is possible, Henry said, reaching into his cardigan pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. I have the original plat right here. Your house sits on a standard lot, but your garden, your fountain, your prize-winning landscaping, all of it extends well beyond your property line, by about, I'd say 6 feet on all sides. The folder in Karen's hands began to shake. You're lying, am I? Henry's voice was gentle, almost grandfatherly. Would you like to see the original survey results? The real ones, not the creative interpretation you've commissioned. David felt the world tilt again, but this time in a different direction. The demolition crew exchanged. Karen Whitmore's hands trembled as she clutched the manila folder to her chest, backing away from Henry Chen's knowing smile. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rubble of David's demolished porch, and for the first time in 20 years of neighborhood dominance, Karen felt the ground shifting beneath her perfectly manicured feet. You're bluffing, she said, but her voice lacked its usual razor-sharp confidence. That's impossible. I had the entire neighborhood surveyed by professionals. Henry adjusted his grip on his walker and took a careful step forward. Did you? Now? And which professionals would those be? Karen's eyes darted to the demolition crew, who were now openly watching the confrontation with growing interest. The lead contractor had set down his sledgehammer and was pulling out his phone, clearly uncomfortable with the legal implications unfolding before him. Henderson and Associates, Karen said quickly. They're the most respected surveying firm in the county. Ah, yes, Henderson and Associates. Henry nodded thoughtfully. I know them well. In fact, I trained young Bill Henderson myself back in '92. Lovely fellow. Tell me, did you happen to mention to Bill that you needed the survey results to come back a certain way? David watched his father with growing amazement. In all his years, he'd never seen Henry operate with such quiet, devastating precision. The old man had always been gentle, preferring his newspaper and morning coffee to confrontation, but now, faced with the destruction of his late daughter-in-law's memory, something steel-hard had emerged in his grandfather's voice. "I didn't. I would never, ... Karen stammered, then caught herself. "I asked for a professional survey. Nothing more." "Of course you did," Henry said gently. "And I'm sure Bill gave you exactly what you paid for. But you see, Karen, there's something Bill doesn't know. Something none of the current surveyors in this area know." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellow with age. This neighborhood was built on what used to be the Riverside Mill property. Beautiful piece of land, but it had some complications. The demolition crew foreman stepped forward. "Ma'am, I think we need to stop work until this gets sorted out. If there's a legitimate dispute about property lines, there is no dispute." Karen's voice cracked like a whip, but David noticed she was sweating despite the cool morning air. "Continue with the demolition." "Actually," Henry said, opening his notebook to a page marked with a faded ribbon, "I'm afraid there is quite a significant dispute. You see, when they built this neighborhood in 1987, they had to work around some pre-existing easements, water rights specifically." David felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard stories about old water rights causing problems for developers, but he'd never imagined it could affect their quiet suburban neighborhood. "There's an underground stream that runs through this entire area," Henry continued, his finger tracing a path in his notebook. "The original mill used it for power. When the developer bought the land, they had to agree to maintain certain setbacks from the stream path to preserve the water table." Karen's face was now visibly pale. That's ancient history. It has nothing to do with current property lines." "Oh, but it does," Henry said, his smile widening. "You see, those water rights are permanent. They supersede all subsequent property agreements. And according to the original mill survey, 1I helped conduct in 1986, that underground stream runs directly through your backyard." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. David could see Karen's mind racing, calculating, trying to find a way out of the trap that was closing around her. "The fountain," David said suddenly, understanding flooding through him. "Your fountain sits right on top of the stream path." "Not just the fountain," Henry said pleasantly. "The entire eastern section of Karen's garden. The prize-winning Japanese maple grove, the stone pathways, the imported koi pond, the gazebo where she hosts her garden parties, all of it sits on protected watershed land." Karen's folder slipped from her hands, documents scattering across the debris-strewn lawn. "This is ridiculous. I've lived in this house for 15 years. If there were water rights issues, someone would have told me." "Someone did tell you," Henry said quietly. "The previous owner, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned it during your walkthrough." "I was there, Karen. I was helping her pack up her garden tools, and I heard her specifically warn you about the stream easement." David remembered Mrs. Patterson, a sweet, elderly woman who'd moved to Florida to be closer to her grandchildren. She'd been meticulous about maintaining her garden, and she'd loved talking about the history of the neighborhood. "You said you didn't care about old wives' tales," Henry continued. "Those were your exact words. Mrs. Patterson tried to show you the documentation, but you said you had your own plans for the garden." Karen's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she sat down hard on the concrete steps of her own house. "Even if that's true, it was years ago. There's a statute of limitations on these things, not for water rights," Henry said gently. "Environmental protections are permanent. And since you've been actively developing on protected watershed land for 15 years, ... double quotes, he trailed off, shaking his head sadly. The demolition crew foreman cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to call my supervisor. This is getting into legal territory that's way above my pay grade. Don't you dare." Karen stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. "I paid you to do a job. I have documentation. I have permits. Lady, I don't care if you have a letter from the president," the foreman said, backing away from her. "If there's disputed property lines and environmental issues, we're not touching anything else without a court order." He gestured to his crew, and they began packing up their equipment. The sudden silence as the demolition stopped was deafening. David looked at the ruins of his porch, then at Karen's panicked face, Then, at his father's calm, satisfied expression, "Dad, how long have you known about this?" "Since the day we moved in," Henry said simply. "I always do my research before making a major investment. I knew about the water rights, the stream path, the environmental protections. I also knew that most people don't bother to look beyond the surface-level paperwork." Karen was now pacing, back and forth, her silk bathrobe fluttering in the morning breeze. "This is insane. You can't destroy 15 years of work because of some old stream that nobody even knows exists anymore." "Oh, but it does exist," Henry said, pulling out his phone with surprising dexterity for his age. "And there are ways to prove it. David, would you mind calling the county environmental office? I believe the number is 555 stream." David stared at his father. "Dad, how do you know that number by heart?" Henry's smile was innocent, but his eyes twinkled with mischief. "I may have called them yesterday, after I saw the demolition trucks. Arriving at dawn, I wanted to make sure I had my facts straight." Karen stopped pacing and whirled around. "You called them yesterday, before any of this happened." "I called them the moment I saw you measuring David's porch with that surveyor last week," Henry said calmly. "I've been watching you, Karen, planning, scheming, looking for ways to hurt my family. I decided it was time to do a little planning. Of my own, the truth hit David like a physical blow. You knew this was coming. You knew she was going to destroy the porch." "I knew she was going to try," Henry corrected. "I also knew that sometimes you have to let people reveal their true nature before you can spout them." Karen's face was now a mask of rage and panic. "You manipulative, old, careful Karen," Henry said mildly. "There are witnesses present, and I believe you're still recording for insurance purposes." Karen looked down at her phone, still clutched in her white-knuckled grip, the recording app still running. She'd been documenting her own destruction of David's porch, and now she was documenting her own exposure. "You set me up," she whispered. "I gave you enough rope," Henry replied. "You chose to hang yourself with it." A van pulled up to the curb, and two people in official-looking uniforms got out. One carried a clipboard, the other had what looked like ground-penetrating radar equipment. "Mr. Chen," the woman with the clipboard called out. "We're from the county environmental office. You called about a potential water rights violation." Henry waved cheerfully. "Right over here. Thank you for coming so quickly." Karen made a sound. "Like a trapped animal. This isn't over. I'll fight this. I'll sue everyone involved. Your lawyer will advise you to cooperate fully with the environmental investigation," Henry said pleasantly. "Because if they find what I think they're going to find, Karen, you're not just looking at removing your garden. You're looking at environmental restoration costs, federal fines, and possible criminal charges for willful destruction of protected watershed land." The environmental officer was already setting up her equipment near Karen's fence line. "Ma'am, we'll need access to your backyard. We have a warrant for environmental inspection based on the complaint filed yesterday." Karen's face went from pale to gray. "Warrant, standard procedure for water rights violations," the officer said briskly. "Someone filed a complaint alleging unauthorized development on protected watershed land. We take these violations." 3 hours later, Karen Whitmore's pristine backyard looked like an archaeological dig site. The county environmental team had arrived in force 5 officials, 2 trucks full of equipment, and enough legal documentation to bury Karen's garden, deeper than any underground stream. David stood at his kitchen window, watching the organized chaos unfold next door while his father sat at the breakfast table. Upside down. "Dad," David said, still processing everything that had happened, "you knew this would happen. All of it." Henry looked up from his newspaper, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Couldn't uncross. I just wanted to make sure that when she did, she'd fall into a hole of her own making." Through the window, David could see Karen pacing frantically around her garden while talking on her phone. Her voice carried across the yards, shrill and desperate. "I don't care what it costs. I need you here now. This is an emergency." "She calling her lawyer?" David asked. "Third one this morning," Henry said, taking a sip of his coffee. "First one hung up when she started screaming. This one's probably going to tell her she needs a miracle." David turned from the window. "How do you know all this?" Henry smiled and tapped his hearing aid. "These things pick up more than you'd think. Amazing what people will say when they think no one's listening." A knock at the front door interrupted them. David opened it to find a woman in her 40s wearing a crisp business suit and carrying a briefcase that looked like it cost more than his car. "Mr. Chen, I'm Rebecca Martinez from the County Environmental Protection Agency. I understand you filed the complaint about watershed violations." "That would be my father," David said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Please come in." Rebecca Martinez had the kind of presence that commanded attention-sharp eyes, confident posture, and the bearing of someone who'd seen every environmental crime imaginable. "With practiced efficiency, Mr. Chen, I have to say, your complaint was remarkably thorough. Most people don't even know what water rights are, let alone how to document violations. I've been in this business for 40 years, Ms. Martinez. I know how to dot my I's and cross my T's." "Indeed you do." She pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through photos. "We've completed the initial site survey. Your neighbor's garden is built directly on top of an active underground stream that's been protected since 1923. The environmental impact is ... significant." Through the window, they could see Karen gesturing wildly at one of the environmental officers, who was shaking his head and writing notes on a clipboard. "What kind of violations are we talking about?" David asked. "Serious, unauthorized development on protected watershed land, disruption of natural water flow patterns, contamination of groundwater through fertilizer runoff, and destruction of protected habitat. Freshwater mussels," Henry whistled low. "Endangered species violations. That's federal territory." "Exactly. This isn't just a local environmental issue anymore. Fish and wildlife will be involved by tomorrow morning." Rebecca scrolled through more photos. The stone fountain alone diverted the stream flow and created a stagnant pool that's killed off about 30% of the mussel population downstream. David felt a chill. How serious are federal environmental violations? Felony charges, mandatory restoration costs, and fines that start at $50,000 per violation. "We've documented at least 8 separate violations so far." Karen's voice carried across the yard again, higher and more desperate than before. "What do you mean, criminal charges? I didn't know." "Nobody told me, actually," Henry said quietly. "Someone did tell her. I have a witness who heard the previous homeowner explain the water rights restrictions during Karen's walkthrough." Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "You have documentation of that?" "I have Mrs. Patterson's phone number in Florida. She's 87, but her memory's sharp as a tack." David stared at his father. "You stayed in touch with Mrs. Patterson, sweet lady?" "We exchanged Christmas cards. She's been following Karen's garden expansion through the neighborhood newsletter your wife used to send out." Henry's voice grew soft. Sarah was so proud of that little newsletter. She always included photos of everyone's gardens, including Karen's prize-winning violations. Rebecca was taking notes rapidly. "Mr. Chen, would Mrs. Patterson be willing to give a deposition?" "I already asked her. She never forgave herself for not fighting harder when Karen dismissed her warnings." A commotion outside drew their attention back to the window. Karen was now arguing with 3 officials at once, her voice reaching levels that probably violated noise ordinances. Her lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit, had arrived and was looking increasingly pale as he reviewed the documentation. "This is insane." Karen's voice cracked across the morning air. "I demand to speak to your supervisor. I have rights." "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent," one of the officers replied calmly. "At this point, anything you say can and will be used against you in court." David felt his stomach drop. "They're arresting her." Rebecca glanced out the window. "Not yet. When people realize they're facing federal charges, they sometimes do irrational things." As if summoned by her words, Karen suddenly broke away from the officials and ran toward her garden. She grabbed a shovel from her tool shed and began frantically digging around her prize-winning fountain. "What is she doing?" David asked. Henry sighed. "Destroying evidence, or trying to. Poor thing doesn't realize she's just making it worse." 2 of the environmental officers moved quickly to stop Karen, but she was in full panic mode, throwing dirt and stones in every direction. Her lawyer was shouting at her to stop, but she was beyond hearing reason. "I can fix this," Karen screamed. "Mud streaking her face in silk bathrobe. I can put it back the way it was. I can fix everything." "Ma'am, please step away from the excavation site," one of the officers called out. "You're contaminating evidence and potentially damaging protected habitat." Karen whirled around, the shovel still in her hands. "Protected habitat, it's my garden. I built this. I made it beautiful. I won awards. Awards don't supersede federal environmental law, the officer replied firmly. I need to get out there before she does something really stupid. Mr. Chen, thank you for your cooperation. We'll be in touch about the deposition. After she left, her lawyer was on his phone, probably calling for backup or trying to find a way to distance himself from the environmental catastrophe his client had created. Dad, David said quietly, I still can't believe you orchestrated all of this. Henry turned away from the window and looked at his son with eyes that held 40 years of surveying experience and 83 years of understanding human nature. I just made sure the truth would come out when it mattered most. But you knew she would destroy the porch. You could have stopped it, could I? Henry's voice was gentle but firm. Karen has been planning this for months. The fence, the driveway, the rose bushes Sarah planted. She was determined to hurt us, and she wouldn't have stopped until she found a way. David thought about the hatred in Karen's eyes, the venom in her voice when she talked about his perfect family. She really hated us that much. She hated what we represented, Henry corrected. A loving family, a peaceful life, contentment. With what we had, Karen could never understand that happiness doesn't come from tearing others down. Outside, Karen was now sitting in the back of a police car, her silk bathrobe torn and muddy, her perfectly styled hair hanging in limp strands around her face. Her lawyer was pacing back and forth, clearly out of his depth. What happens now? David asked. Henry folded his newspaper and stood up slowly, his joints creaking with age. Now Karen faces the consequences of 15 years of willful environmental destruction. And we, ... He paused, looking out at the rubble of David's porch. We rebuild the porch. All of it. Henry's voice grew stronger. Karen thought she could destroy our memories by destroying the place where we made them. But memories aren't made of wood and nails, son. They're made of love and time, and the decision to keep building something beautiful even when others try to tear it down. A news van pulled up to the curb, followed by another, then another. Word was spreading about the environmental violations, the federal charges, the neighborhood HOA, Queen who'd fallen from grace in the most spectacular way possible. David's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter at college. Dad, is it true? Mom's garden is on the news. He looked at the message. 2 weeks later, the neighborhood that had once been Karen Whitmore's kingdom had transformed into something resembling a federal crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered around her property like funeral ribbons, and the constant parade of investigators. Lawyers and news crews had turned their quiet suburban street into a circus. David stood in his front yard, watching yet another van full of equipment pull up to Karen's house. This one belonged to the Army Corps of Engineers, who were conducting their own investigation into the watershed violations. The irony wasn't lost on him. Karen had always complained about too many cars on their street, and now her actions had brought more traffic than the neighborhood had ever seen. Mr. Chen, a young reporter, approached with a camera crew trailing. Behind her, Channel 7 News. Could we get a statement about your neighbor's environmental violations? David was about to decline when his father appeared beside him, moving with surprising speed despite his walker. I'll handle this, Henry said quietly, then turned to the reporter with a grandfather's smile. Certainly, young lady. But first, let me ask, have you reported on the real story here? The reporter looked confused. The real story? You mean the federal charges? I mean the pattern, Henry said, his voice carrying the authority of 8 decades of experience. You see, this isn't just about one woman breaking environmental laws. This is about what happens when someone uses power to hurt others for years, and how the truth always finds a way to surface. David watched in amazement as his father, who usually avoided attention, began to tell Karen's story with the precision of a master storyteller. How she'd terrorized neighbors for years with frivolous HOA violations, she perceived as weak. You have documentation of this? The reporter asked, her eyes lighting up with the scent of a bigger story. Henry smiled. 15 years' worth. Every complaint, every violation notice, every intimidation tactic. I may be old, but I'm thorough. As the camera rolled, David realized his father was doing something brilliant. He wasn't just defending their family, he was exposing the systematic abuse of power that had been Karen's real crime. The environmental violations were just the final fatal mistake in a long pattern of using authority to harm others. 20 minutes later, after the news crew left, David's phone began ringing. The first call was from Janet Morrison, a widow who'd moved away 3 years earlier after Karen had made her life unbearable. "David, I just saw the news. Is it true? Is Karen really facing federal charges?" "It's true, Janet. They arrested her yesterday." There was a long pause, then the sound of quiet crying. "She destroyed my roses, you know, the ones my husband planted before he died. She said they violated the landscaping guidelines, but they were inside my property line. She just ... she just wanted to hurt me because I was grieving." The calls kept coming. Tom Hendricks, who'd been forced to sell his house after Karen filed 17 violations against him in 6 months. Steve and Linda Parker, who'd had to take out a second mortgage to fight Karen's false claims about their fence placement. One by one, Karen's victims were coming forward, and David realized the true scope of her reign of terror. His family hadn't been her only target, they'd just been her latest. The irony deepened when his daughter Melissa called from college, her voice tight with emotion. "Dad, I've been thinking about what happened to Mom's garden club." David felt his chest tighten. "What about it? Remember how it fell apart right after Mom died? How suddenly no one wanted to host meetings anymore? I thought people were just giving us space to grieve." "Dad, I was 15. I heard things. Karen told everyone that Mom's newsletter was unprofessional and that the garden club needed better leadership. She basically took over and then dismantled it piece by piece." David sank into his kitchen chair, the phone heavy in his hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were barely holding it together. We all were. And I thought it didn't matter anymore because Mom was gone." Melissa's voice broke. "But it did matter. That garden club was Mom's pride and joy. Karen destroyed it just because she could." After he hung up, David found his father in the backyard, sitting in the morning sun and staring thoughtfully at the rubble where the porch used to be, heartbroken about it before she died. "She didn't want to burden you with more stress, so she kept it to herself. But I knew. Is that why you really did this? Not just about the porch, but about everything Karen took from us." "Karen made one crucial mistake," Henry said, his voice carrying a weight David had never heard before. "She thought that because Sarah was gone, there was no one left to protect her memory. She thought she could rewrite history, make it seem like Sarah's contributions to this neighborhood never mattered." A black sedan pulled into their driveway, and to people in business. Suits got out. David recognized Rebecca Martinez from the environmental agency, but the man with her was a stranger. "Mr. Chen," Rebecca called out as they approached. "This is Agent Harrison from the FBI. We need to talk." David felt his stomach drop. The FBI, and been impressed by none of it. "Mr. Chen, we're investigating financial irregularities in your HOA's management. Your neighbor's legal troubles have opened up some interesting questions about where the community funds have been going." Henry leaned forward in his chair. "Financial irregularities. Mrs. Whitmore has been the HOA treasurer for 8 years, Rebecca explained. Discrepancies in the community accounts, approximately $127,000 in unexplained expenditures over the past 5 years. Professional landscaping services, legal fees, property improvement costs, all approved by the board, which consisted of Mrs. Whitmore and 2 other residents who, coincidentally, never received any violation notices, despite obvious landscaping infractions." David felt the world shift again. She was embezzling HOA funds. It appears she was using community money to pay for her own garden improvements, legal costs, and surveying fees. Agent Harrison continued, "including the survey she used to justify destroying your porch." Henry started laughing a dry, knowing chuckle that grew into full-throated laughter. She used community money to pay for the survey that proved she was violating community property. She literally paid for her own downfall with stolen funds. "There's more," Rebecca said, "the professional survey she commissioned. It was a rush job. Henderson and Associates did exactly what she paid them to do. They found problems with your property and ignored the massive violations in her own backyard, but they kept detailed records of her specific instructions." Agent Harrison nodded. "Bill Henderson is cooperating fully with our investigation. He's provided recordings of conversations where Mrs. Whitmore explicitly told him to focus on finding violations with neighboring properties or environmental issues." David shook his head in amazement. She orchestrated her own destruction. "Gets better," Rebecca said with a grim smile. Most of her assets were purchased with embezzled funds. The federal government is seizing her property for environmental remediation. "What does that mean?" David asked. "It means Karen Whitmore's house is being claimed by eminent domain," Agent Harrison explained. "The entire property will be converted back to natural watershed habitat. Her house will be demolished, and the land will become a protected wetland preserve." Henry stopped laughing abruptly. "Her house will be demolished. Complete environmental restoration," Rebecca confirmed. "It's the only way to repair the damage to the stream ecosystem. The endangered mussels need their habitat restored, and that means removing all human development from the area." David looked across the yard at Karen's house, the pristine white colonial with its perfect shutters and manicured lawn. In a few months, it would all be gone, replaced by native plants and flowing water. "Where is Karen now?" he asked. "County jail," Agent Harrison said, "to 20 years in federal prison." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. David found himself thinking about the woman who'd stood in his driveway 2 weeks ago, and environmental restoration orders. "There's one more thing," Rebecca said, pulling out an official-looking document. "The federal government wants to offer you compensation for the destruction of your property, since Mrs. Whitmore used illegally. Obtain funds to pay for the demolition, you're entitled to restitution." David took the document and stared at it.